Woo! I'm not even dancing, but you could imagine.
I can't do this.
I love this music. I groove in my car when I'm going back listening to it for, idiosyncrasies or whatever. Hi. This is Keith Knight. I'm a pastor here at Stonebridge Church on the southwest side of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'm joined by my brothers in arms. To my left is
Steve Duffy.
Nice.
Brandon Levering.
Across from me, directly across from me, awkwardly directly across from me. And to my right?
Josh Casey.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm explaining to people the spatial
No, it's kind of fun because they're probably like
relationship.
sitting in their car or their home and they're now imagining us.
Yeah, but if they've never seen us, I wonder what we sound like.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you drew a picture of us of what we sounded like.
I grew up listening to Garrison Keillor, just Lake Wobegon. I don't know.
And then you
it's
saw
just
him?
amazing. And I saw him,
You were
like
shocked?
my world is ruined. Like it's just like the face I pictured for my whole childhood was nothing like the man himself.
No, yeah. He was Prairie Home Companion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, Chris Thiele took that over. You know who he is?
Mm-mm.
He's the mandolin player for Nickel Creek and Punch Brothers.
Huh.
He's a really good musician.
The students have adopted a sign in our group time of rabbit trailing.
Oh, in case you didn't see what Steve did
course you didn't
over
see
the
it.
radio, he's holding up rabbit ears.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because we're 1 minute in and Keith is off track.
I mean, welcome to my brain.
Yep.
I'm off track with myself. I'll start a train of thought with myself, thinking through things, and then I end up in the middle of the worship center from my office going, why am I out here? I almost feel like I was abducted by aliens and dropped in the middle of the worship center, like routinely.
I was prompted with the rabbit ears by the look on Josh's face, like, what's happening here?
Well, what is happening here? We're starting a little bit lighthearted because we're going to go into a topic that is absolutely not lighthearted.
Mm-hmm.
Did you plan this whole series to continually scale to more terrifying depths of discussion, or what?
I mean, kind of, not really intentionally, but there is a progression, right? So, and kind of grouped it for some foundational matters, like just the first sermon, the concept of being exiles and strangers, and the second one on how to talk to one another. So the cancel culture, outrage culture, like those were intentionally foundational. And then it kind of moves from there into issues of division.
Mm-hmm.
So politics, abortion. Next week we're looking at race.
Yep.
And then issues of confusion. So expressive individualism, homosexuality, transgender. So there is a madness.
Mm-hmm.
A method to
There is a madness to my
there's
method.
Both.
That's good. I'm glad there's a method behind it. We know the madness is there.
So yeah, it does have the accidental effect of ramping up
Good.
each week.
Yeah,
So
I'm
there's that.
actually excited. This is going to sound weird. I'm actually excited to talk next week about race because I do think that is a discussion that needs to continually happen in the church because there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of traps in that we can fall into faulty thinking in a number of ways. So I think that'll be helpful next week. But today we're going to talk about abortion, right? Which is almost seems like, at least in conservative evangelical Christian circles, almost kind of seems like a home run. Like some people may be like, well, I'm pretty sure I know what they're going to say. We're against abortion, as a rule, which is true. But when we talk about abortion, we're not just talking about it as a political issue. We're talking about it as a gospel issue, which is the goal in this
the whole
discussion.
Point of the sermon series, yeah.
Right. So then the first question that we are going to approach then is basically, the pro-life stance. How is it that sometimes pro-life doesn't necessarily mean that that's going through a gospel filter? There are people that are pro-life that are not Christians, or not even deists, maybe even maybe the atheists that are pro-life for the sake of pro-lifeness. I don't know, but the point is you can be pro-life, but not necessarily filtering that position through the gospel.
Yeah.
So then, how do we make sure that as we're approaching that, we take a gospel-centered approach to being pro-life?
And what do we lose if we don't? I think is equally important to weigh.
Before we get too far, could we do a quick definition? What's the difference between a biblical approach and a gospel approach? I think sometimes we choose a text and we say, this is our decision as Christians, and here's our text. I'm not sure that's what we're intending when we say gospel. Just how is the gospel approach different than that?
So in one case, those terms should be interchangeable. Like if it's truly biblical, it ought to be filtered through the person and work of Christ. Functionally, that doesn't always happen. Like you can take a Bible passage and use it as a weapon, or take a very legalistic approach or something, and it's based on this verse, and so it's biblical. And so a truly biblical approach would be taking the whole counsel of God,
right,
and bringing that to bear, and the centerpiece being, again, the person and work of Christ. All of Scripture's pointing to Christ, all of Scripture's flowing from Him. And so the way we obey it must be filtered not just through law, but also grace, both at the same time. And so, one of the phrases I've been using through the series is kind of, sin really is sinful because God is holy. Grace really is sufficient because the blood of Christ is enough. So that specific, we're not just trying to be biblical in a sense of, is this right? Is this, can we find a verse in Scripture for this position? We want to apply the good news of Jesus in its full breadth, which is, I think, again, the fullness of a biblical approach would be a gospel-driven, gospel-centered approach. So
agreed. With the only caveat I'm throwing in there is in the case in which there are distinct, specific commands forbidding such things.
Sure,
it's woven into both, right? So I think that's where it gets like. If you're using a passage out of context, of course, there are a number of passages in the Old Testament we were talking about before where God is commanding, it's a very specific command, but don't pass your children through the fires or offer them as sacrifice to Molech.
Yeah.
And so there was a practice in which there was child sacrifice, and sacrifice was an abomination. So it was commanded to the Israelites, hey, don't do this because the act itself is an abomination.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know it's not a direct one-for-one, but there are multiple horizons, I think, with this issue because there is the, thou shalt not kill, which is, so that's a gospel issue in that to deviate from the Decalogue in trying to live the gospel doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where, in my summary, I would get into the sin really is sinful part of it, right? I think where maybe the distinction you're after there, Josh, or at least that practically comes out, is you can get some folks who are only trying to apply the law.
Agreed. Yeah.
You've been treating the Decalogue as though it's like something that's supposed to be for all societies when it's, there's biblical principles true for all societies, but it was very specific to Israel as the covenant people.
Sure.
And so if we're only applying the law but not following it with the grace of the gospel, we can build a society with a lot of restrictions and safeguards, but no safety net for when we fall.
Right.
And we will fall.
Yep.
And so, having that both sin is wrong, grace is enough.
Yeah.
Keeping those up. Because I think that to me is maybe the biggest challenge for evangelicals is that we can be so adamant, and rightly so, about defending life and stopping abortion and calling out sin for what it is, that we can be terrified if that's part of my story. So for instance, I've been at Stonebridge for coming up on 4 years now.
Holy smokes, man.
I know,
Really?
isn't that weird?
Yeah, it just makes me feel older.
Well, the
You
shoe
are.
fits.
We're getting old.
But
Shut it.
so I've been here almost 4 years. This is the first week anybody has ever told me their story of abortion, right? And so, meaning, and then there can be all sorts of factors. That's the topic this week. But, do we have a culture that people feel safe to say, I messed up in this way, and the grace is sufficient? Whereas if we're only hitting on the law piece, then when I mess up, I've got to fix that myself. I've got to keep it to myself. All those kinds of things.
Right.
And so that's why I think that it's so important to keep that both law and gospel, law and grace together as we shepherd, as we advocate, as we
Well, the way that you delivered the message this weekend, you've been watching my sermons. Did a lot of crying.
Yeah.
I did get that comparison made on several accounts.
What has he done to you?
By the way, those Kleenex are horrible. We gotta
they're
get
terrible.
A much
It's like
softer
when your
box.
wife buys Willow for toilet paper.
You need the lotion.
We're
ones.
obviously not
and
sponsored
you
by
just,
Willow.
and you burn it.
Or will
You
ever
burn
be.
it. Listen,
Kindle.
lady, if any ladies who are listening, for the love of the Lord, please don't buy Willow toilet paper.
I think we have.
Hey,
No
speaking
sponsor.
of Willow toilet
Not a
paper,
sponsor.
actually, definitions. The pro-life. When you said pro-life.
Oh, good.
By the
good,
way,
good, good, good.
we're all
Good
about
job.
segues here. So
Yeah.
when you talk about the pro-life, this will come up later, so we don't. But I just want to put a placeholder. Pro-life as a trademark, so to speak, in terms of organizational element of rally versus principle. Pro-life,
Yeah.
right? So that'll come up
That's
later in
interesting.
I think a question that you sent out regarding movements or strategies or
Yeah, yeah.
tactics in action. Just want to highlight when we say pro-life, sometimes the thought immediately goes to an organization, right?
Gotcha.
Which, by the way, has unbelieving people, non-Christians,
Agreed,
as
yeah.
part of that. So that just something to highlight that we'll talk about later.
It's good to see.
Can we broaden this out? So, as one of the things that I've been thinking of as we've been prepping to talk about abortion is there's this thing that's kind of underlying that I think is a gospel issue, which in general, like even among Christians, there's a casual almost approach, even jokes that kids are kind of a nuisance, right? And you can look at churches like, hey, we don't really want the kids in the service. This is adult time. These are distractions. Or like even me growing up hearing the phrase from a lot of older people in church, children are to be seen and not heard. There has been a growing culture, even in sort of modernity, with that's anti-gospel in that we are like almost anti-creation mandate, like be fruitful and multiply. Like we are say that we're pro-life, but I don't know how many people are truly like pro-children. Right. And that's kind of I think that's kind of a problem. So like the gospel thing is like, you can't just be to Steve's point about like the organization, you can't just be like, hey, I'm pro-life, but then kind of carry around this idea that children are not something to be treasured and to spend time on and to enjoy, like raising them up and investing in that. And one of the knocks from people who are kind of pro-choice or pro-abortion or pro-choice to the pro-life movement is you guys want them to live, but you're not nearly as concerned about their quality of life, which I think is actually for maybe not every Christian, but for a lot of Christians is a pretty fair critique, is that we seem to be like, well, we want them to be alive, we just don't want them to be our problem.
Yeah.
So that's
And I
part
wonder
of the gospel approach to being pro-life
the
too.
holistic approach. And as you were talking about that, it makes me think about how much abortion the current abortion crisis is downstream from other cultural problems. Right. And a big one being just what we'll talk about in 2 weeks, expressive individualism and the sovereign self. Right. So if life is about me, if I'm the center of the universe, or if my identity is what I desire, what I want, do you, all that kind of stuff. Well, that comes, with that comes a sexual revolution, right? So I am what I want, and for you to deny me that sexual fulfillment, that's for you to deny me my right to happiness, and that's for you to deny my personhood, and so on and so forth. And so we open the doors there. And with that, then, okay, to the extent that children make me happy, great. To the extent that they don't, that's a knock. And so much of kind of the abortion crisis, I think, does flow downstream from some deeper dysfunctions in the human psyche of just the sovereign self and so on, and not recognizing the Lord's design both for humanity but also for family and community and those kinds of things. And rugged American individualism doesn't help any of that, right? So the message that we're working against is not just this isn't a person or not.
Right.
Underneath all of that, the message is you're the center of your own universe, and you do whatever is going to make you happy, and you shed anything that's not.
Right.
That's verbatim from what I've heard some of the youngsters saying to each other recently. So
relatively speaking, I'm a youngster to you.
Thanks.
So so I'm going to say something like that. Then. No, I'm not actually. But I think you make a really good point there. My rights, the expressive individualism of my rights. I think that's a part where it has caused me to scratch my head a little bit, in the conversations of even just talking about rights when we're talking about these is, I would even say something like right to life. That's where I was like, right to life. It sounds good. And then thinking about, women's rights and then in hearing both sides of the issue using the words rights. And it sure sounds like there's like it goes beyond where I don't see that in scripture, of like that we have the rights in the way that we're speaking about rights. It almost seems, 1 Corinthians 6:19, you are not your own. It's as though all life is a gift from God to be stewarded by God. And that to me, I don't hear that as much as I would hope to. And to me, that's a gospel principle of, this, we are not sovereign over all those things. And so then when we go into the rights, it sounds like we go into something that's more of like legal, and property, and that kind of a thing, as opposed to a gospel posture of stewardship.
Yeah, that's good. Now, to the credit of, is it the Declaration or the Constitution? All creatures are endowed with these
inalienable rights.
Rights.
Yeah, that's
life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness.
Declaration.
Endowed by their Creator. Mm-hmm. So there is a kind of a natural theology underneath some of those rights, by the fact that you're made in the image of God.
Or your image bearers, so to kill, it's the same thing with the principle of Cain slaying Abel.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So and God has given you the right to live.
Right.
He could take that away as God, right?
He's the only one that has the ability to do that.
He's the only one who has authority to do that.
Yes, authority, right.
So there is some nuanced wisdom in that particular version of it. However, we've taken that and we've run so far down the road with, again, just demanding my rights, my right to 1,000 different things, and again, instead of recognizing these as a gift from God to be stewarded, to Josh's point, they're this intrinsic thing that I can wield over anybody else. And so it's just kind of, I become the sovereign self. Rather than a gift from the sovereign, life being a gift from the sovereign, I become the sovereign self. And
Well, I think, and you made you had very helpful advice for people who are going to be engaging in discussions with people who are pro-choice. What the acronym that you use, SLED,
SLED,
right?
Mm-hmm. That's I think Scott Klusendorf came.
Yeah, and it's really, that's really helpful. But because when you really get to it, like if you were to push those who advocate for, abortion, those who advocate for the determination of a pregnancy, intentionally, they're disingenuous in the way that they talk about such things. And I think that's part of the reason that we tend to kind of lose the gospel is in the fight, they're not going to listen to us talk about the gospel maybe purely. And so there are certain levels in which in order to achieve a hearing with certain people, you have to face the arguments as they come. But the chiefest one is that this is not a biological this is not a person, right? This is not something that has cognizance, which is it's just a lie. It's disingenuous. We know that that's a person because you mourn the loss. Celebrities. There was a popular celebrity couple who were like, vehemently pro-choice, and they lose a child, and they put on Instagram how sad they are that they lost this child in utero, and I'm like, dude.
Yeah.
So don't lie to people about how this is like reproductive health when you know that this is a baby.
Yeah. The only distinction that comes out is the wanted baby is a child.
Right.
The unwanted one is not human.
Right. And you're the determiner of
exactly. Yeah. My desire determines reality.
Right.
And again, it's deception. Like there's so much deception in the whole thing, and so learning to reason persuasively is so critical. And you're not gonna convince everybody, right? At the end of the day, we need the Spirit of God to open eyes, right? The more we can, and I was encouraged, like, there were at least, one person who went into the sermon Sunday morning that was, kind of knew what we believed, wasn't really comfortable with it, was still kind of like, I think really this is up to the mom and none of us should have any business dealing with this. And by God's grace walked out convinced that he'd been wrong and repenting and confessing and all, so I was just, so there is, I think when the heart is good and the Lord is working there, we, arming ourselves with those persuasive arguments is helpful. Anytime deception is reigning, we've got to shine the light of truth there.
Right. What is it that causes? What is it that causes some people who would say that they're like pro-gospel to dabble in what they would call gray areas of this debate? Because that's one thing that comes up too.
Well, I think there are some genuinely hard questions with it, right? So for the vast majority of folks, it's just a black and white issue, right? And I think some of the gray areas where you'll get these debated on both sides for the pro-choice movement. These are the exceptions that demand the rule, right?
That are like less than 1% of
so rather than maybe gray edge cases, does that seem like gray meaning
like I would say there's for most Christians it's a black and white issue, but some of the edges might look a little gray, and so.
Basically, situational ethics as it applies to abortion.
Yeah. And so for the pro-choice, that's the chink in the armor by which we can try and attack the argument. But I think at the same time, there's some genuinely confusing issues for some. Like, questions of rape and incest. You're going to find Christians landing in different places on that one. Questions of the mother's life being threatened. You're going to find Christians landing in different places on how to deal with some of those things. How do you guys wrestle through those? Not that we're going to fix all of this right now, but just out of curiosity, as you process that, because these are questions, again, they're super uncommon situations, but they're the ones that we gravitate to and as we're trying to prove the rule. But what about this? If this rule's here, what about this? I think that's a legitimate question. How do you guys personally work through some of those?
I've always just taken the position that I'm a Calvinist, so I believe that in those specific situations, especially for Christians, you do what I feel like Scripture supports and commands, and then you entrust God with everything, right? And I think as a married couple, if you get a married couple that the woman's health is in danger, and I think they just need to pray and be convinced of what the Lord wants them to do. I think that Haley and I, if we were in that situation, we would be like, probably we're gonna have this baby, and we're gonna trust the Lord that if the doctors say this isn't gonna work, that the Lord will, and if He doesn't, we'll still pray. He'll still be praised. I think that's in terms of like rape. I don't believe that you should punish the child for something that they had nothing to do with.
Because the child meaning the baby?
The baby. Yeah. And right. And I know that there's a lot of people that would disagree with me on that, but I know some friends, that had terrible life situations, and probably a lot of people had said, you should. I know people who were even teenagers and pregnant and wasn't the great situation, and they had relatives be like, you should get rid of this baby because it's going to be hard, right? But it's been a beautiful thing, and it's not that kid's fault. And they know Jesus, and they're walking in life of the gospel, and what a terrible thing it would be to just be like, well, you're too much of a reminder of something terrible. And to treat a child as though they're just a reminder of something terrible is really bad.
It makes it somewhat, to me, that posture makes, I would agree with you on that. That last comment you made, it makes, if the child or any individual is a reminder more than they are an image bearer of God,
right?
Yeah.
We've lost the focus of what the individual is.
Agree.
And I think this issue and many issues, I think we all would agree, are very complex. I think this issue is more complex than what Christians often are willing to admit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's a lot of times we think that there is more black and white in this than there is, you know, but we're speaking into, you know, a post-Christian context that I think a lot of what we're talking about and why we all would agree on, you know, our stance on these is because we're coming at it from a Christian, you know, posture where we're looking into the Bible and understanding, you know, what it means. Whereas, you know, when, you know, to the point of the rights thing, I think that's more of an American, you know, Constitution kind of argument. Whereas we would say it's more of, you know, we're not sovereign. And I'm right there with Keith then on that is, I feel like the church needs to be a community. I mean, that'd be the biggest thing I would advocate more is we need to be a community that can help each other with these things. And so if any of those situations comes, it's got to be situational, you know, like you got to talk through it. You know, I can't say one thing for all, but it's really complex. But I would lean, I would say, I can't imagine a scenario in which I would say that the baby would not be born. Like I would always encourage that because I feel like I steward life. Like that's what I'm told to do.
And to your point, I just want to bring up an example of what I think is I talked about this before we came on, but and I don't remember the name of Jeff Durbin's church in Arizona. Apologia Church, yeah. But they have a ministry where they'll go to the abortion mills, the abortion clinics, and stand outside with signs that are like, "We will adopt your baby." They will vehemently debate, you know, Christian ethics with people but they won't say like, "Hey, think of this from it." They'll just be like, "The Lord says this is wrong. You know, God is going to judge this sin, but we want to help you." So my personal thing is like you can have a very distinct view in which you are trying to tell people, no, these values of God need to be impressed upon a society that even rejects God. So long as you are willing to walk the mile that's necessary to back up that contention, not just to say, "Hey, you're wrong, you know, you're going to be judged," but to say, we will stand on what the Lord says, but we are also going to follow the command to come alongside you. Like if you need help with this, we will help you. If you're worried about money, we have people in our church that will help you. If you're worried about you don't want to keep this baby, we have people in this church who will adopt this baby and support you. And if you decide you don't want to, you know, that you want this child along the way, but we want to help you all over. We don't just want you to stop and go home and take care of the kid yourself. Yeah. We want to help you. And so that's where I think that we can only in good conscience make very distinct statements like that in, you know, sort of impressing the Christian faith on a secular nation if we are willing to then practice the back end of that gospel and back up what we are saying. And just like not God is just commanding you, but the God who commands you to do these things will come alongside you as you respond in faithfulness. And that he does that through his people, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Maybe to add on the question, you know, what would you do, or what are your thoughts about edge cases? You know, when you think about like just take rape or incest, already that's a dark and complex situation on top of, I mean, that by itself, if there's no life, a baby at stake. I think it's critical to stand on and filter the response through the biblical convictions that we have. Otherwise, if we lend any of our response to emotion, especially in those cases, we really tread, I think, a thin line. And so biblical convictions that we've already talked about the inherent value of life, being an image bearer, you know, Genesis 1, the idea that life starts at conception. So this is a life no matter how that life was the cause of that creation in terms of rape or incest. So Psalm 139. And that, you know, the taking of that life is murder. And so standing on those, I guess for me personally, I don't know how you could land in a place that's different than if it was just, you know, a married couple, let's say, and they made a decision that's not the right time, as you mentioned on Sunday. And I'm not trying to minimize the difficulty of those situations. I'm simply saying we have to, especially in challenging situations, we have to operate out of the biblical conviction in my opinion, in order to rightly apply the gospel. if we give leeway and permission to sin, then what is the weight of the grace that accompanies that? Our counsel of grace, through the gospel, if we're not bearing truth to the situation. So we just have to trust in the idea of trusting that God will still is sovereign and will provide his provision through the gospel, through our help, would be sufficient. On the other side of that counsel of saying, here are still the fundamental truths that we abide in and stand on. So it's tough. It's tough.
It's hard. It's hard to imagine the trauma and all that would go into that. But it's like finding, say you're in a marriage and you shouldn't be getting divorced, but you do it anyway because you're selfish, and then you remarry somebody, and then all of a sudden you realize down the road, holy cow, that was wrong. You don't rectify that situation by divorcing again.
But you can't, because Scripture says
exactly. So sinning in order to fix a sin never actually does that. And so or even sinning to fix a victimization. And so again, it's complex, but the biblical convictions of life have to, for me, that's what I would want to go. Like, there's not just one person's life being evaluated here in this response. There are two people going on. And I think it's trickier for the life-threatening pregnancy to a mom. I think, like you said, a family has to wrestle through that one.
Yeah,
That's where
agreed.
I don't think you can quite legislate that one, because you can legislate the killing of against the killing of an unborn baby, but in a situation where you can't, I don't feel like it's right to legislate that you must die for the sake of this other person. You could choose to risk your own death, but I don't think the law can stand and say you must make this decision. I think that has to be wrestled out.
Yeah, I don't think that's the. I don't think that anybody, if they're genuine, is going to seriously take that any person who's pro-life would want that to be the law.
Yeah.
So that's it's like, less than 1%
for me. That's
cases,
like the one exception of legalities that I don't think you can legislate the requirement of risking, and especially in some cases like an ectopic pregnancy. Sadly, that baby will miscarry. There's no biological way for it to survive, and so whereas if it does grow and such, it very likely will kill the mother. And so there's just those kinds of hard situations where there's all sorts of grief into them. It really becomes a miscarriage in that sense of, but
I think if and the slippery slope there is maybe the lack of definition of the cases that would apply. Otherwise, you have a potential open door to have interpretation of what's life-threatening.
And we're seeing that, like well-being becomes the new definition instead of like actual
reproductive health,
surviving. So am I going to die, or is my life going to be adversely affected? And those things get fused together. And you're right. There is a slippery slope there.
And there is a posture of, in most cases, except for what was the scenario you bet the
ectopic?
Oh yeah. So in other words, the embryo is not in the uterus; it's somewhere else, and it's not. It's not going to be. It's not going to end well should it continue. So any other case, if it's not like that, would be. I think what Keith maybe you were alluding to is we're going to trust the Lord through this and triage as we go. That's kind of the theme or the posture I had heard, but
I think that couple has to, especially I think some of the hard scenarios people find. I've got 4 kids. Do I stick around to parent them? I would hate to be in that situation, having to wade through that. That is a hard situation, and so you just pray for wisdom and grace, and you pray for miraculous, intervention of God. So.
But there's a couple things that come to mind we can't discuss. One of them at length. There is a certain pro-life position in which it's just real bad theology, which is like, if this infant doesn't get baptized, they're going to hell. But we do have to, that needs to be dealt with too, because there is a pro-life position that is almost solely based on real bad theology. Yeah. Not solely based, but it's largely around like, well, what happened? These kids aren't going to have an opportunity to actually be saved
if
So
they're not, yeah.
if they're
yeah.
so
That
we're
would
not going to get
be-
into that.
Yeah.
But there is, and I don't think enough Christians actually know the differences in theology there to even know that that's an issue.
Yeah.
So,
that's good.
but the other thing is just the history of eugenics, right? The history of child sacrifice and eugenics. I shared that looking back in history, the reason that God commands not to sacrifice your child is because it was a big deal, like to make your life better. I mean, you sacrificed a child to a god because you thought that they were going to be pleased with the sacrifice and then your crops would be better and everything. Well, then, they found these mass graves in Carthage, that the Phoenicians evidently practiced child sacrifice a lot, like tons and tons of babies. But even the article that's in this archaeologist that's writing about it is like, well, we just don't understand what, maybe we just need to understand that their culture, they saw these things differently. And honestly, the living conditions, the mortality rates were higher. So we don't know what somebody would be thinking. Like maybe it actually did make life better. But that's the kind of mentality that we're dealing with. It's not even like most people are wrestling through the morality of it. They just want life to be better for quote unquote society, which is where eugenics comes in as well. Margaret Sanger and in France and Sweden, a lot of European countries, like even Sweden, just, hey, the celebrate, hey, we're eliminating Down syndrome.
Yeah,
I'm like, what a
eliminated-
terrible country you are, you jerks. Like,
They've eliminated all people with Down syndrome. There's a big difference.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the point. Is if we get to the heart of this, like when we talk about the pro-life and the gray areas, we get caught up in the gray areas, but the gray areas are not. That's not intellectually honest for the pro-choice side to be bringing up, because that's not what they really want. It's control, either racially motivated, mental issues, like not just what they would consider to be like at one time, mental quote unquote retardation, which is the words that they used to use to describe such people, but racial purity in some cases, like, or even
Or
just people who
controlling the
have
racial
psychological disorders. I mean, that's historical too. Some of eugenics was if somebody had schizophrenia, like, oh shoot, we need to eliminate this in a family, so we probably shouldn't let them have children. I mean,
the forced sterilization that happened with a lot of that.
yeah. So I mean that's the real argument. I mean, that's where a lot of these real
It was
arguments
the
are coming
origin
from.
of so much of this.
Yeah, but it's perpetuated. Even if you talk in, you can almost wrap this discussion with next week's discussion. In some cases, in terms of race, and especially as it applies to African Americans in those communities, like it was deemed as population control. I mean, in the opening up these clinics in the poorest areas in order to control the poverty by way of killing children. That's really disingenuous to say that was not the root of some of this, at least in America.
It's documented.
Right.
As,
Yeah,
at
make
least-
that
And that's where
key.
and like to Steve's point, I don't want it to be an emotional argument, but it's like an emotionally charged gospel argument, because I don't like having conversations with people who are trying to play a gotcha on me and like, well, what about that? I'm like, you don't even care about that. Like, all you care about is the ease of your life. Like, it doesn't occur to you that these children could grow up and have a great life and contribute to society. You just want a shutdown answer to make you feel better about this procedure,
Not that you have to go in a lot of detail, but you mentioned Margaret Sanger. Just make the connection between that and your previous comment. You just who she just so for people know.
Margaret
and they can
Sanger
look.
was kind of the spearhead of Planned Parenthood. I mean, she and the reproductive health and quote unquote reproductive. The whole quote is reproductive health and reproductive rights for women, but a lot of her writings, I mean, just being associated with conversations with the KKK, which is documented, and many of her statements on even the black community and how it was
ugly stuff.
It's very ugly stuff.
So ugly that Planned Parenthood, at least in some portions of the country, have completely distanced themselves from her.
Right.
Because she's such a toxic, association.
Right.
Because it's just so overtly racist.
Right.
Yeah.
So the gray areas, I do think they're worth discussing as Christians, but I do think we get hung up in the gray areas.
Yeah, they can become the smokescreen for
Right,
a bigger
right.
issue. Yeah.
So then from the gray areas into issues in general, one of the things that we talked about, we threw out to each other prior to the podcast was abortion has become almost, so when it comes to elections and stuff like that, tends to make a lot of elections kind of a single issue. Like if this is the case.
Yeah, I mean, I would say at least for, well, no, this is probably true for both sides, right? It becomes the single issue which I vote this way, whether Republican or Democrat, and every political calculation I make in the voting booth is relative to this one issue. That's a pretty common posture for, I think, a lot of voters today. And I think it's worth asking, just out of curiosity, how do we think about that? And what's either the general wisdom or the potential danger of that kind of single issue voting?
I mean,
because it would be an assumption for many people today that that's just what you should do. Are there some?
Yeah, I think there's.
Let's poke at it a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's to me there are a couple things in it. Is when we are expecting the government to do the work of the community of Christ. I think it's when we put our, regardless of what we're doing as a church, as Christians, we expect that when I check that box, that's my Christian duty, because then now that my champion, he or she will now go do and make legal or illegal the things that I believe my convictions are. And then we oftentimes will feel that we've done our Christian duty on this issue, to vote for the person. And I can't find that in Scripture. I think that's the part is where we co-opt the or we outsource Christian community and ethics to and love and care and all those things to the vote. And so I think that's one side is we make that the activity that we do and think that we're good there. The other side is that we bundle the one issue could oftentimes, like we don't do this in other areas of life. That one issue could be there could be a whole bunch of bad stuff that comes with it, and so we say, because of the one thing, because that, we're dating, and because that person is rich, that checks the box, even though they're a terrible person. Like we don't do this in normal decision making, but for some reason in politics, we decide, I'm just going to look at the one thing. Or some people do. I don't want to say we do. I don't do that. Not everyone does that. But sometimes if we make it a one issue, thing, then we forego many of the other things that are there. And we need, a consistent, holistic ethic when we approach, that if we really are thinking that's going to get the job done, we need to be approaching it more consistently to all of Scripture.
That's good.
I mean, I wish we had a theocracy, if I'm honest. I mean, continuing this on from my Knoxian political stance is I believe that any ruler is beholden to God. Like, honestly, every president who's ever been the president of the United States is going to stand before God and answer for the way that they governed. Every congressman is going to stand before God and answer for the way that they voted and governed. So I do think we need to take that seriously. I do think we tend to take the gospel out of, last week, politics and issues because we think we're in a secular society. We're not in a secular society. Like, Jesus is the sovereign. Like, that's Scripture.
Remember the strangers and exiles piece, though. No, we're in the not yet.
But
still.
Here's the thing, though. He's coming back to claim it. But he's also coming back to claim it. This world belongs to God.
Absolutely.
And so we're strangers and exiles only because the Lord is allowing Satan and his minions to have a certain amount of power and influence now, but he's going to take it back, right?
Absolutely.
And so I do think keeping that in mind is helpful. And I will say this for myself. I don't trust anybody who is pro-killing babies. And it doesn't mean I trust somebody who is pro-life for the sake of political affluence, right? But I will always take the candidate who is pro-letting children live versus helping the structure and funding the structures that are killing babies. So I'm one of those voters who are like, if there's two guys that are both kind of a hot mess, but one of them's like, hey, we're going to try to overturn Roe v. Wade, I'm for that person.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm for that administration because I do believe that the harshness by which our nation would be judged as a nation is at least partially dependent on the fact that we seem to be okay with slaughtering. I mean, more deaths than all the other wars combined, right?
Yeah.
And just killing our own children.
Yeah.
that's a big deal to me.
Yeah.
And so I tend to fall on that side as far as how our nation will be weighed and judged.
I think it's I think that's you make good points. The idea that we if we have two hot mess of candidates, you would choose the one that would be pro-life.
Yeah.
I think that's a great situational ethics for a Christian to do, and you've modeled that well of thinking through that. If we are approaching it only as a one-issue thing, that isn't the same thing. Like it just that process by selecting a candidate is oftentimes, I think what you're asking, Brandon, I understood is pro-life. Who's pro-life? We don't even need to know who the name is. All we need to know is that they're pro-life, and then we just connect the name to the ballot. You're weighing out other issues there, and then applying the situational ethics. So I would say I would agree with. I would do the same process you do, Keith. I would not do the process maybe that Brandon was asking us about of just saying, just find out who's pro-life and go with them.
Correct. Yeah. Which, I think each person has their version of that. So that's why I was curious how you guys work that out. Yeah. For a thing so common as single issue voting, how do each of you guys work that out? What about you, Steve?
I think I'm pretty consistent with what's already been described. Now the challenge, so it maybe historically abortion has been like the hot button sort of moral thing on the radar. Now there are multiple moral hot button things. Yeah. So what do you do with that? As long as I think you work through it the way that was just described, like Keith and Josh just affirmed, and you as well, Brandon. It doesn't matter how many moral hot button topics are on the radar. That line of thinking to help you arrive at a conclusion is good. One of them is going to bubble to the top. This is the most important. Yeah. But the reality is, I like that. Who did you say? Two hot messes. We have two hot messes of candidates. That's always going to be the reality, I think. So I just accept that and try to figure out already resolve.
Do you not remember Ronald Reagan? It's a joke.
He was a hot mess
joke.
too.
Come on.
They're all hot messes. We're all hot messes. We're in light company. So but just again, keeping those other biblical convictions in mind, Josh. I like what you said is that my hope is not in this man to accomplish something. Sorry, Keith. To move the gospel forward to affect the lives of people. I can't be satisfied in even the Roe v. Wade thing. Being disbanded, as you noted, Brandon. Now the fight is in the states, and just consider what happened in Minnesota recently with their recent. It's horrendous, and so that ought to keep us alert and awake and active as to where the real battle lies, and that's in the heart and lives of those that we can actually influence here. Not to say we don't have a national responsibility, but our greatest impact. What can we do here?
Yeah,
we'll also be talking about this is something for us to remember as when we come to gender. Like what is passing now is being billed as gender affirming care is actually on the down low sterilization of young people who in most cases are probably gay, but they're being forced into gender transitioning and gender affirming care when they're younger. And I actually think this is a low-key way of sterilizing a number of people who may just be confused because of certain social cues. We'll get to that when we get to gender. But I do think it's not just, I think if we're talking pro-life, it's not just abortion anymore. They're finding ways to go around abortion in order to affect people who are already living in a way that's very much pro-death. Right? Yeah. And so that's what's making it, as Steve said, it's making it a little bit more complicated.
I'm pretty close to both of you, or all three of you guys, in that generally speaking, I'm going to prioritize a pro-life candidate for obvious reasons. I think what's been helpful for me to understand is that whereas that becomes the single issue for I wouldn't say it's always the single issue for me, but I think it's one of the key ones, and it's very often a single issue. Not every Christian has that as the single issue that rises to the top. So if you look at your the historically black church, who for the most part votes generally Democrat, and if our assumption is, well, they must all be pro-choice, then we'd be dead wrong. They're Democrat typically, despite the pro-choice position of that party. They're Democrat because there are other issues that seem to rise to the top kind of socially and care and things like that affect them and in different ways. And so that's where, and one could have a reasoned debate of whether that's a good idea or not. But that single issue, making abortion the single issue thing, I think where it's clearly a matter of conviction, and I tend to lean that way, it can also create some unhealthy division among Christians where, we're agreed on a biblical principle, but for so many, it's like we were in a stalemate for 40 years. We could make progress over here on these things. We're not going to accomplish anything over there on that one. So let's put our energy over here. And so just kind of that recognition of Christians do land in different ways, not because of supporting abortion, but because there are other ways the culture of death reaches out and strangles communities, and some of those ways have been prioritized in different cases.
I think I hear that and understand that, and I sort of reject that only because I think it's very hard for me. This is me, okay? Mm-hmm. So you're getting both the emotional and the emotional filter I run the gospel through. First of all, I mean, how could you not like Donald Trump? He said himself he's done more for Christianity than anybody else has. So I feel like...
Is there a bleep button?
Yeah, we're going to cut that out, right?
This is me throwing a hand grenade in the middle. But in all seriousness, it's very hard for me to take... If you're listening and you're this person, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. It's very hard for me to take somebody seriously on what they prioritize as other issues when they don't seem to first prioritize, we want people to be alive. I get it. I get thriving.
That's not prioritizing.
I understand. But I have, and this is just me. Again, I'm not declaring. I'm saying I have a personal problem. And so let me give you some background. When I was 16 years old, I was at a summer camp, and they had a woman who went around and lectured. She used to work in an abortion mill. And she came and shared a number of stories and pictures and the procedures when I was 16. And I sat in that room and bawled. I didn't have any idea like what that was like. Mm-hmm. None whatsoever. Once I discovered what that process is, and that she told stories of like hearing this faint, weird kind of screaming sound, and there was a baby in the trash can that had been injected with saline solution that was not dead yet, like dying in a trash can, I was like, over my dead body. Like, I'm never going to let anybody think that this is okay. Okay. So I have a hard time. I have a very hard time when a Christian is like, well, I don't think this is the biggest issue. I think in a lot of cases, maybe they haven't investigated the intricacies of what is involved in a lot of those processes.
I think you'd be pretty wrong in that assumption.
Maybe
though,
I might
because what's I think, and again, I'm kind of representing others here,
sure.
So I may not be doing it accurately. I think most of the time, the evangelical Christian who ends up finding themselves in the Democratic Party despite their abortion agenda is working to prevent that upstream. So if we can address poverty, if we can address fatherlessness, if we can address some of these social factors that contribute to why women end up down here, then child care, if we can kind of free child care, reduce the costs of births and so on and so forth, which generally speaking the Republican Party isn't that interested in as a priority. At least this would be the argument.
I don't think any party is interested in that as a priority.
And so if we can address some of the social issues upstream, we can do just as much to prevent getting there. And so that would be much more, I think, in line with the rationale.
I understand that. And I get it. My position to that is probably related to my political position. It's like, if you think any of those politicians actually give up about what you think, they don't. Like, they're all making bank off of you,
sure,
and posturing on their positions. So like, I think that's where I think it's maybe uninformed in some cases, or disingenuous in some cases. And some people just feel like, hey, we got to work and this is the way things are going to change. I tend to think
I guess
with the gospel thing, but this is where we get into
the motives or the uninformed.
I don't know the
connecting
motives.
the dots in different ways.
I don't know the motives, but this is again how I feel is if when we talk about even last week with politics and this week with abortion, I think we're talking about it in categories of how do we adopt a gospel position. But the gospel position is not to particularly rely on politics to get the job done. It's to rely on, I think how we vote and what we do are two different things.
Yeah.
I would vote, hey, let's save babies, and save women from making decisions that might be harmful to their own actual health, and for sure the health of their child who's a living person. But then let's find ways to get out and actually bring the gospel to bear in those. And that's what I'm saying, like, instead of voting for politicians who are going to make economic changes for this, why don't Christians take on those economic burdens? Like I mentioned with, Durbin's church, like if Christians are saying, we will help you, like in your situation. So if you have 3 kids and you're a single mom and you're pregnant again, you're not sure you can raise that baby. We want to help you.
Absolutely.
That's where I would say, like, if we're going to be active in helping fix those problems, the fatherlessness and stuff like that, I would prefer to do that as the church rather than rely on politicians to do that. But that's more, I'm trying to describe, this is my whole politics gets wrapped up in this, and that's why I'm a single issue voter, is I actually think that's an issue worth voting on, and the other things the church can be doing without waiting for the government to do those things, which is why we're kind of in the position that we are politically, is because we've trusted the government to fix all the economic stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry.
And that's good. The only other counter I would say is that I think most of those churches are doing those kinds of things probably more than the white evangelical church in terms of social reform.
Yeah, and I don't know.
And so
that might be true.
Yeah, so I think the single issue voting, like I think it's totally fine to be a single issue voter. Where I get concerned is if we impose our single issue onto others, and again, we can have those conversations, but the assumptions that can kind of flow underneath them can create an unnecessary wedge where we're actually all working on the same thing, but we've got different methods and tactics that we think that are going to work best, right? And I think that happens in all sorts of issues than just abortion. Poverty, caring for single moms, all sorts of things. We can be aiming for the same thing, but be very convicted that this is the way to accomplish it. And we should be convicted. We should be convinced. We should argue vigorously that this is the way, so long as we don't create unnecessary divisions with teammates. Like, that's kind of, I think, the point I'm advocating for.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the pendulum swinging to the no doubt not maybe, but it is the pendulum swinging toward the government to handle the social issues is the exact issue that Josh brought up initially. Is that we also wouldn't want on the other side to rely on the government to make progress in the whole abortion topic. Although we'll advocate for the laws, but the progress comes in what is our gospel opportunity and work as a church to raise up young people, to raise up families, to establish the nuclear family as a primary source for the kind of care we're talking about, and to nurture that and support it in all facets of our stewardship.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, and back to that leads back to the thing that I brought up earlier was there are quite a few Christians that, and even I would say, all of us at times, it's much easier to be like, that's a shame, than to actually do something about it, right? So if every Christian if all the Christians in each community in the United States were to decide we are going to actively work at helping people who are in these positions, right? Like it's like the 40 years of ministry that Bridgehaven has done here in Cedar Rapids, like actually coming alongside people who are afraid and giving them hope and saying, like, we're going to resource you, we're going to help you. Like, there are a lot of issues that even, conservative Christians rely on the government for, and conservatives are typically people like, oh, we don't need big government. But the reality is the conservative side of the government is just as big as any other, you know what I mean? And so with the exception of a few people, but if more of us would actually, instead of relying on politicians to get things done, we were actually living pro-life orientations, right? We would eliminate a lot of abortions probably
absolutely.
just by ministering to people in the community. So
I think so. That to me is where I would prefer and do spend more time and effort is in the area of what is the Christian community doing. There's a very good chance that I will never, unless something changes in my own thinking, I will never go to like a rally of any kind. Like that to me is not the best way to accomplish it. I think helping people understand how to be hospitable in their homes with their neighbors. I think, one of your statements in the or urges in the sermon on Sunday, Brandon, was to the fathers tell your daughters that no matter what happens, there is grace in this home, and we will go through this with you. To me, that is a very powerful, very small thing that we need to be doing to then be that, light. You are a light on a hill, and to be that gospel witness to the point that if we were just doing those simple things and being a community of grace, my hope would be that at some point people would say, why on earth did, I think you even said that, why on earth do we do abortions? Have that, but they would at a certain point where we may see in our lifetime, why would I do this? I have a church. That's the Acts. In Acts, everyone was sharing with each other as they had need. And then I love in Acts 4, it says there was not a needy person among them.
Mm-hmm.
What if the mom that just found out she's become pregnant, whatever the scenario is of that baby that's being developed, what if she just always thought, oh, whatever happens because I've got Christian community.
Mm-hmm.
To me,
Amen.
that's where I want to spend my time and energy. And so getting into the politics of it is a part where I am willingly a stranger and exile and say, I will let the Declaration of Independence declare rights and the Constitution figure that out. But I want to put a whole lot more effort into this community.
Which is the beauty of becoming that alternate city, right? That alternate kingdom, that outpost from heaven. Here's what it could look like. Like, here is what we look forward to in being that embodied presence and witness of the kingdom of God, living differently in the world, being that city on hill. Like, that just is such a compelling... Well, you look at Matthew 5, it's compelling, it's beautiful that they might see your light and glorify God. It also sometimes makes us a target.
Sure.
Don't be surprised. Blessed are those who are persecuted. So that light has different effects as it hits the world.
Yeah.
But boy, how beautiful and compelling is that if the church were to set the pace at this kind of care and prioritizing of life and community and all of that. And again, as long as we're in this world, I do think there's a political question that we have to navigate and we'll continue to wrestle with. But putting that priority emphasis on how do we just do this in our own homes, in our own communities, in our own neighborhoods, that's huge.
The church historically has taken care of people that the government wouldn't take care of.
That was absolutely, that was the early church. One of the things, they kept going and collecting the babies that people were discarding. And that was frustrating to the Romans.
Well,
right?
they also were the people who were left to die from the plague. Like they were taking care of those people.
Yeah.
So there is historical precedent that you don't just there's both. I think, and I don't want to. I from the last week's conversation, I am firmly embedded in rigidly conservative politics,
Sure.
and I will probably always stay there. But the knock on rigid conservatives is a fair one. Like, we tend to only care about the issue, seemingly, but we don't care about helping solve it. And I think that's a fair critique. And I think that's a scathing critique if you're a Christian. So if you're on the right and you have something to say about these things, but if a woman came to your door and said, I really need help, and you're like, sorry, I can't help you, then you're not really concerned about life. Right, you're not really concerned about thriving of babies. If you're a Christian and you're like, man, kids are annoying, you're not really pro-life. you're just kind of pro you.
or pro
You're pro your
birth
life
for a political
Well,
reason.
and to the point, you're pro your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, and you don't care if anybody else has those things, so long as you do. So to the point that gets levied, I do think we need to embrace some of the criticism that when we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, even for most Christians, we're just talking about ours. We're not talking about everyone's. We're just talking about
it's
ours.
Costly.
Right.
It's costly to talk about
Because it requires
really mean
sacrifice.
it. Exactly.
And it seems like the two guys that first walked by that guy on the side of the road believed in their own life, liberty, pursuit of
Sure
happiness.
did.
But that good Samaritan really leaned into the
Right.
into the costly amount of that
Right. Yeah.
for the sake of the other.
So maybe one last question.
This is a good discussion, by the way. I think.
Yeah,
This is a good
absolutely.
modeled discussion.
What are some of the practical ways where we can get more skin in the game as Christians? Where
Yeah, Keith mentioned Bridgehaven. I think it's a good one. My wife and I, or my family, because it's the whole family takes part in it, has been for years a part of a thing called Safe Families, but things like that. So it's not just simply the
it's
pro
kind of an
the
emergency
pro birth
foster care.
Yeah, it's not the pro birth thing, but it's to care for the moms that are there, and the parents really, usually moms, to give them some respite, so because they've taken on the task, to do the thing, and usually we find that they've not been given that community of love and care, and they've not been helped. They've not even been raised in a way that would be good to model, and they're just going off of what they can. And so it gives them a chance to maybe get some help there. So that could be one that's, after the birth, side of things.
Yeah.
But we've had friends take babies within a couple of months of being born even and take them for a while. So that'd be one. Safe Families would be a good one.
Oh, everybody's looking this
Well,
way. So I guess that's my prompt. My
You did the
cue.
breathe in. You.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One lingering question for me is just this idea of how in the world do we? Well, your example, Brandon. There are a group of people that came up to you after this weekend's message, and this has been the first time in years that you've heard that some folks have gone through this and had an abortion. So it highlights the point that this is often in secret. And maybe many times not disclosed, and so there's a hidden guilt, shame that kind of comes with that. So yeah, the layering question for me related to that: if it's in secret after the fact, what about before the fact? When somebody who's maybe abortion minded, considering an abortion, right? How do we get proximity to those folks to let them know ahead of time that, and I don't know what it looks like. I don't think we need to chart out a program. I think we just need to say, make it known that we're available to help, and then we'll figure it out as we go. And I mean not just say help, but so I'm thinking things like we have a foot in the door at Bridgehaven. We do have a foot in the door of ASAC, Heart of Iowa, and here are two places where women who probably find themselves in these situations will go or end up. And so how can we, that's my lingering question. How do we get access to have our voice heard, that we desire to be a community that does exactly the things that we're talking about, come alongside and tangibly care for people for the long haul, not just say it, but do it. So those are the things. And it's just, I don't know any other way unless it's disclosed. And even more so now today, where abortions may not be happening in a clinic, but through a pill over mail order.
Yeah, really.
And if it's happening that way, all the more element and deception of the evil one to keep it secret and just to be okay with it happening. So yeah, just trying to get, how do we get visibility to the local church in our context to say we want to help and we want to figure out what that looks like.
And I don't think anyone's really speaking to this. So I'm not speaking against any of the things that have been said, but a lot of the things that we're talking about right here, just with Bridgehaven, Safe Families, just getting proximity as the church, itself. Those are kind of organizations. Those are collections of people doing that. But it sure seems like the church has done a nice job. Over the years. In its infancy, this is how it became a force. Is that intimate, hospitality, that's there. Is that idea of that. Really get to know your neighbors. Like, if you have that deep trust and they know that you're for them, but they also know that you stand for things. There's a relational component that, I don't know where we find out the mail order, contraception or pill or whatever it would be. And until we actually have that trust with a person and they disclose it with us. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. The first step is just go talk to people and love them and hear their story, and then go back and do it again and do it again and do it again. And then eventually those things may come up. And that's, we just are so segregated in our society, just so isolated in our society that there's no chance for trust.
Well,
where that could.
I'll see that, and I'll raise you in saying, having spent a number of years in youth ministry, I think one of the biggest mistakes the church has historically made is believing that our young people, A, believe the same things that we think about current issues, and B, feel like they can be honest enough to reveal what life is like in most of their highly secularized environments. Okay, and the point that you made, that again, Steve already mentioned this, but and Josh mentioned it as well, was emphasizing the grace that needs to be happening in the homes, but having honest, biblical, gospel-centered conversations and instilling biblical ethics in young people, believing that they are part of the church now. Yeah. But we are so lazy with that. Like, we wonder, well, how do we get to a point in time where this many Christians think, divorce is okay, or this many Christians think premarital sex is okay, or this many Christians think that, the abortion pill is okay? It's because we've been so concerned maybe with things like politics, or even things like just how do we look as an organization, that we have largely abandoned the teaching of our children in the ways of the gospel, and the freedom for them to grow up in an environment in which they know that if they screw up, grace is going to be applied to that. So I do think that a lot of times, one of the mistakes we make as churches is to look so very focused to the outside that we forget to actually raise our own subsequent generations to believe the gospel. Wow. And I think that's a huge work that we need to be double down on, especially with what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of weeks is things like sexuality and gender. We're losing that battle, really, in terms of a gospel battle. So
yeah, it's good.
Whew.
It's a good conversation.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. You want to do another hour?
No, because I'll let you know it did raise 2 degrees in here since we've been in here, and it's now at 65.3, and I can't feel my limbs.
I lost feeling to my fingers.
It's all my hot air, I think.
Yeah, 63 something when we came in. I'm like, no wonder I can see my breath.
All right, fine. We'll close it up. We'll pick up next week with lighter topics.
That's right.
Like race. Maybe I'll be sick next week. Just kidding. Thank you guys. Thank you, gents, for your honesty. And, one of the things that we hoped this would accomplish would be for us to be able to point, counterpoint, model positions, and ultimately arrive at the bond that we share in Christ and the gospel. And so if you have questions, follow-ups with these things, please don't just sit on these things. Talk to somebody about them, especially if you're listening to this and you've either maybe had an abortion or considering an abortion. We would implore you to talk to somebody about that. Like seek counsel, prayer, support, grace, and don't kind of hide in the shadows.
I think that's maybe the parting word, especially for those who this is the first time you're like, okay, I might be able to bring this into the light.
Yep.
Because it's part of a lot of people's story.
Yeah.
The grace of the gospel is sufficient, and at least at Stonebridge, our prayer and goal is that you would find a community that will not shame you, but will walk with you and help you find healing in Christ.
Right.
And that healing is sufficient, and we all need it, no matter what our sin is. So just that appeal to find the grace of Christ.
Yeah. Thanks, gentlemen. All right. We'll talk to you next week. Bye.